The prince lied to the whole palace, tested every heart around him. And what she said next broke the lie wider than the doctors ever could. But the one person he never wanted to lose caught him standing.
Welcome to African Ruth Stories, where we share the rich cultural heritage of Africa.
This is part 2 of the royal story of Crown Prince Obinna, the prince who pretended to be more helpless than he truly was to test the hearts around him. In part 1, his dangerous secret nearly collapsed when Chidinma, the humble maid he could not stop thinking about, caught him standing, just as an outside medical team arrived at the palace to expose everything. But what happened next was even more shocking. If you thought the lie was the biggest problem, you have not yet seen what the truth was about to destroy. The prince thought he still had time. He was wrong, because before sunrise could save him, the truth had already reached the palace gates. Main narration: the palace did not sleep that night. It listened, it waited, and it feared what morning might bring. Outside, the convoy had arrived faster than anyone expected. Dr. Emeka stepped down with his assistants, carrying the kind of calm that only men with no secrets can carry. But inside the palace, every corridor already knew what his arrival meant. This was no ordinary visit. This was the beginning of exposure. Servants lowered their voices. Guards stood straighter than usual. Even Queen Ngozi's chamber, once a place of command, had become a place of silence. Because for the first time since her son returned home, fear no longer looked like illness. It looked like deception. And in the royal study, the sealed letter on the king's table said only one thing that mattered. The examination would happen, and once it happened, everything could change. But the doctors were not the first danger. The first danger had already happened, because the one person Obinna never wanted to lose had just seen the truth with her own eyes. Main narration: in the quiet of his chamber, Obinna had stood from the wheelchair again. Not fully healed, not fully strong, but standing. He told himself he only needed a few more days, a little more time, a little more control, a little more distance between himself and the consequences of his own plan. But fate entered the room before he could sit back down. Chidinma opened the door carrying water and medicine. And there he was, on his feet, alive in a truth the palace had not been allowed to see. For one long second, neither of them moved. The tray in her hand trembled. Obinna looked less like a prince in that moment, and more like a man caught by the only person whose opinion could break him. When Chidinma finally spoke, her voice was soft. But the question was merciless. "My prince, what is this?" And with those 4 words, the lie became heavier than Obinna had ever imagined. She expected an explanation. What she got instead was a confession that changed the entire story. Main narration: Obinna did not lie to her again. Not that night, not after being seen so completely. He admitted that his injury was real, but not as severe as the palace had been led to believe. He had chosen to appear more helpless than he truly was. He had used the chair, the silence, the pity, and the shock to test everyone around him. The princesses, the servants, even his parents. He wanted to know who loved him beyond the crown. Who would stay when power looked weak? Who would still speak gently to a broken man? But Chidinma did not react the way he expected. She was not impressed by his strategy. She was hurt by his character. "You tested everyone," she said, "and in doing so, you turned truth into a trap." The words struck harder than accusation. Because they were honest. Before leaving, Chidinma made one thing clear. She would not expose him like gossip. But she would not carry his lie either. Then she told him something he would remember long after that night ended. When truth is delayed, it does not become safer. It becomes heavier. And when she left the room, Obinna realized the one person he most wanted to keep close was the one person his lie had pushed away first. But Chidinma was not the only one sensing the palace was hiding something. Because some people do not need the full truth to know a secret is bleeding through the walls. Main narration Princess Folake had heard enough outside the study to understand that this was no simple medical concern. She had not heard every detail, but she had heard the hesitation, the urgency, and the careful language of people trying to delay disaster. That was enough for her. Folake was not a foolish woman. She understood power. She understood performance. And she understood that when royal people stop speaking clearly, it usually means truth has become dangerous. So she made a decision before the night was over. She would not wait for answers to be handed to her. She would find them herself. And the first person she chose to pressure was Tunde. Because loyal men always know more than they are willing to say, and sometimes their silence says everything. Pause Scene 5. Tunde's silence makes things worse. Hook voiceover. Folake asked one simple question. Tunde refused to answer it. And somehow, that told her even more than the truth would have. Main narration. Under the lanterns of the west veranda, Folake confronted Tunde directly. Why was the palace afraid of a medical examination? Why had the king delayed it? Why did everyone seem more worried about discovery than recovery? Tunde answered carefully. Too carefully. He said the palace was only protecting the prince's rest. He said tensions were normal. He said some matters belonged to the royal family alone. But none of that satisfied Folake. Because when a man avoids a question with too much discipline, he does not erase suspicion, he confirms it. By the time Tunde walked away, Folake no longer wondered if there was a secret. She knew there was one. And now her interest had changed. This was no longer about marriage. It was about leverage. While the palace prepared for scandal, the one person with no crown gave the wisest advice of all. Main narration. The next morning, Chidinma was allowed to visit her mother. The contrast between the palace and that tiny room was painful enough to humble any illusion. Gold walls and royal halls meant nothing here. In this place, survival was still measured in medicine, food, and one more week of strength. But Mama Ifeoma was more alert than Chidinma expected, and like all mothers shaped by suffering, she could read what her daughter was trying to hide. So Chidinma told her enough. Not every detail, but enough to reveal that the palace was carrying a dangerous truth. Enough to say that the prince was not exactly what everyone believed. Enough to show that her own heart had become tangled in a storm she never asked for. Mama Ifeoma listened quietly. Then she said the kind of words only life can teach. Royal houses do not collapse because of lies alone. They collapse when good people help lies stay dressed. Chidinma asked what she should do. And her mother answered without hesitation. Stand where your soul can still recognize you. Those words would guide every choice she made after that. By afternoon, the queen had only one question left, and the answer came from the maid no one expected to trust most. Main narration. After Folake quietly planted suspicion around Chidinma, Queen Ngozi summoned the maid to her private room. It was not a public interrogation. That made it even more dangerous. The queen stood near the window and asked only one thing. What happened in my son's chamber last night? Chidinma felt the weight of that question immediately. Protect the prince, protect herself, or protect the truth. She chose the hardest path. She told the queen what she had seen. Obinna had been standing, not fully healed, not free from pain, but standing. For one silent second, the queen closed her eyes. Inside that breath lived two emotions no words could separate: relief and heartbreak. Her son could stand, but he had let his own mother suffer beneath a lie bigger than necessary. Still, Queen Gozi did not scream. She did not collapse. She did not lash out at Chidinma. Instead, she recognized courage where she found it. And before dismissing her, she said something the palace would later understand was true. "You have more courage than many people born to silk." Then came the moment Obinna feared more than exposure itself. Not the doctors, not the council, his mother. Main narration: Queen Gozi entered her son's chamber without warning. There was no ceremony between them, no soft language, no royal distance. Only a mother who had just learned that pain and deceit had been living side by side inside her own child. She gave one order: stand, and Obinna obeyed. Slowly, painfully, honestly, as he rose from the chair, the queen saw everything at once. Yes, he had been injured. Yes, his recovery was incomplete. Yes, the pain was real. But so was the lie. And what hurt her most was not that he had hidden pain. It was that he had allowed her to grieve more deeply than truth required. Then she made a decision that changed the course of the palace. He would confess before the council, before the king, before the entire royal hall. If truth was going to arrive, it would not come in the hands of strangers. It would come from the prince's own mouth. Pause. When the royal hall opened that evening, everyone expected an examination. No one expected a confession, and no one was ready for what happened next. Main narration: the assembly hall was full. The king sat upright in measured silence. The queen watched with a face no one could read. The three princesses stood together. The council members waited. Dr. Emeka and his team stood nearby. Even the servants lining the walls could feel that history had entered the room. Obinna was wheeled into the center, and then the king announced that before any doctor would speak, the prince himself had something to say. The air changed instantly. Obinna began carefully. He admitted that his injury was real, his pain was real, his fear was real. But the full image presented to the palace had not been true. A murmur ran through the hall. Then he told them everything. He had exaggerated his helplessness. He had returned in that condition to test the hearts around him. And in searching for honesty in others, he had discovered dishonesty in himself. Then came the image no one in that palace would forget. Obinna pushed himself up and stood, not proudly, not perfectly, but truthfully. And the hall gasped as if the lie itself had suddenly taken human shape. Pause. Some were angry, some were disappointed, but the most dangerous reactions were the calm ones. Main narration: Princess Folake was the first to speak. Her anger was sharp and justified. Had they all been brought to the palace only to become part of a prince's cruel experiment? Had their dignity been measured without consent? Had the entire selection process been shaped by deception from the start? Obinna did not resist her words. He accepted them. He admitted she deserved truth. Then Princess Adesi spoke, and her tone changed the room. The lie was wrong, she said. But confession freely given before forced discovery is not the same as truth dragged into daylight. Princess Amara added her own quiet judgment. Pain, even when misused, is still pain. That was the moment the hall stopped being simple. Because now, no one could pretend this was only scandal. It was shame. It was injury. It was love. It was pride. And it was all tangled together. And just when the hall thought it had heard enough, the maid stepped forward. And one sentence from her changed everything. Main narration from the servant line: Chidinma stepped into the open. No one expected it. A maid had no place interrupting a royal proceeding. and yet no one stopped her. She bowed to the king and spoke with a calm that felt stronger than rank. The prince had done wrong, she said. But he had not been a healthy man pretending to suffer. He had been a suffering man pretending to be worse than he truly was. That did not excuse the lie. But if the hall judged only the deception and ignored the injury beneath it, then it would not be hearing truth. It would be hearing punishment, selecting only the parts it preferred. Silence fell immediately. Because moral clarity sounds different when it comes from someone who has nothing to gain from speaking. The queen's eyes shone. The king leaned back, and Obinna looked at Chidinma as though she had just saved him from becoming smaller than his own mistake. The doctors still examined him, and what they confirmed did not erase the lie. But it made the truth impossible to simplify. Main narration after the confession, Dr. Emeka and the outside team completed their examination. Their findings were clear. The prince had suffered genuine nerve trauma. His movement had returned in part, not in full. He could stand. He could take steps. But his recovery remained incomplete and painful. The report embarrassed the palace. At the same time, it protected it. Because now the story had shape. This was not a healthy prince inventing weakness from nothing. This was a wounded man turning his injury into a weapon of emotional testing. Still wrong, still dangerous, still painful, but deeper than scandal alone. And in royal matters, complexity changes judgment. By nightfall, one princess had made up her mind. She would leave the palace. But before she left, she said something Chidinma could not forget. Main narration Folake requested departure before dawn. Her pride would not permit her to remain in a palace where trust had been used as bait. But before she left, she asked to see Chidinma. In the side courtyard, under a deepening sky, the two women faced each other without titles, without witnesses, and without performance. Folake warned her that palaces often praise courage in public and punish it in private. Then she asked the question Chidinma least wanted to answer. Do you love him? Chidinma did not reply directly. So Folake gave her own truth instead. She did not love the prince. She might once have respected him, perhaps even admired him, but she could not belong to a man who wounded trust in order to measure it. Then came her final warning. If you stay near him, she said, demand better than admiration. And with that, Folake left the palace not as a defeated woman, but as one who had refused to bow before dishonesty. Paused that same night, the prince asked to see Chidinma again. But this time, he was not asking for secrecy. He was asking for a second chance he had not yet earned. Main narration Chidinma entered his chamber cautiously. Obinna was seated by the balcony doors, dressed simply, looking less like royalty and more like a man stripped of excuses. He thanked her for coming. Then, he told her something he could no longer hide. What he felt for her was not gratitude, it was not curiosity, and it was not a temporary fascination with the only honest person in the room. It had become something deeper. But Chidinma did not surrender to the moment. She answered with the kind of truth only strong women can give. Love without truth becomes another elegant lie. She told him plainly that she could not build her future on a man who spoke beautifully one day and hid from consequence the next. Obinna did not argue. He only asked what she wanted from him. And her answer became the standard for everything that followed. Live honestly long enough for honesty to stop sounding like a performance. That was not rejection. But it was not forgiveness either. It was a door, and he would have to reach it the hard way. Pause, the confession was over. The scandal had passed. But the hardest part of the story, was only just beginning. Main narration: the king suspended the marriage selection. The council postponed its deeper decisions. The queen ordered that Obina's recovery be managed honestly from that day forward. No altered reports. No hidden progress. No theatrical weakness. And then the palace entered a quieter season. Weeks passed. Not with miracles, not with easy forgiveness, but with change. Servants saw the prince walking with a cane in the courtyard. Guards saw him stumble and rise again without complaint. The king saw him attend to duty without drama. The queen saw him replace apology with discipline. And Chidinma saw all of it from a distance she controlled carefully. That distance mattered, because this was no longer the story of a prince performing pain. It was the story of a man learning whether truth could survive after strategy failed. Then one evening, 6 weeks later, Chidinma was sent to the old East Pavilion. She thought she was carrying out an errand. She was actually walking into the most important moment of the story. Main narration: when Chidinma entered the pavilion, Obina was already there. Standing, a cane rested in his hand. There was no wheelchair beside him, no audience, no palace witnesses, no performance, only honesty. This time he did not rush toward her. He had learned that truth does not chase. It waits. He told her he was not there to ask for immediate forgiveness. He was there to ask for permission to begin again without disguise. No tests, no manipulation, no hidden version of himself, only truth. Chidinma listened carefully. Then she asked the question that separated romance from reality. What if the kingdom refuses? What if the council says a maid can never stand beside a prince? Obina answered without hesitation. Then let the kingdom decide whether it wants a future built on appearances or one built on character. This time the words did not sound polished. They sounded earned. And that changed everything. At last, Chidinma gave the smallest smile. Not a promise, not a surrender, but a beginning. Then begin well, she said. And in that quiet pavilion, between apology and hope, the future took its first honest step. The wheelchair was still there. But it no longer controlled the story. Because this was never just a story about a prince pretending to be broken. It became a story about whether truth can rebuild what pride nearly destroyed. Main narration: the palace grew quiet again. But now it was a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of secrets, the quiet of consequences. Obina had confessed. Chidinma had refused to be weak. The queen had chosen wisdom over pride. And the kingdom had learned that the strongest heart in a palace does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears the uniform of a servant. And if love was ever going to survive between the prince and the maid, it would survive only one way. Honestly.